The concert hall fell silent as the last note echoed through the air. Another standing ovation. Another perfect performance. Richard Sterling took his bow, his tailored suit catching the stage lights just right. At 30 years old, he had already played in every major venue across 3 continents. Critics called him a genius. Fellow musicians either admired him or envied him. But lately, something felt off. He was bored, not with music itself, but with how easy everything had become. Every piece he touched turned to gold. Every audience loved him. Every review praised his technical brilliance. Where was the challenge? Where was the thrill? That's when the invitation came. The Riverside Music Academy wanted him as a guest instructor for their spring masterclass series. It wasn't Carnegie Hall or the Royal Albert Hall, but the Academy had a reputation. Some of the finest young talent studied there. Richard saw it as an opportunity, not just to teach but to remind everyone why he stood at the top. His first day at the Academy started exactly as he expected. The building itself was impressive. All marble floors and high ceilings with the smell of old wood and rosin hanging in the air. Students whispered as he walked past, pointing and pulling out their phones. The dean greeted him like royalty, practically bowing as he showed him around. The master class was held in the main auditorium, a beautiful space with velvet seats and a gorgeous grand piano sitting center stage. 50 students had been selected to attend. They sat in neat rows, notebooks ready, eyes wide with anticipation. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. He dove straight into his first lesson, demonstrating a complex passage from a Liszt etude. His fingers moved so fast they almost blurred. The students watched in awe, scribbling notes frantically. "You see," Richard said, his voice carrying that hint of superiority he'd perfected over the years. "This is what separates the professionals from the amateurs: precision, speed, control. If you can't master the technical aspects, the emotional ones don't matter." He noticed movement near the back door. Someone was standing there, half in the hallway, half in the room. It was a woman in a plain blue uniform, the kind the cleaning staff wore. She held a spray bottle in one hand and a cloth in the other, but she wasn't cleaning. She was listening. Richard stopped mid-sentence. The students turned to see what had caught his attention. "Excuse me," Richard called out, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "This is a private masterclass for students only." The woman looked startled. She had a kind face, probably in her mid-30s, with her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her hands were rough, the kind that came from years of hard work. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, starting to back away. "I was just finishing up the hallway. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "Finishing up?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Or eavesdropping?" A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The woman's face flushed red, but she didn't look away. "I like music," she said simply. "I heard the piano and stopped for a moment, that's all." Something about her calm response irritated Richard. Maybe it was the way she didn't seem embarrassed enough. Maybe it was the fact that she, a janitor, thought she belonged anywhere near a discussion about serious music. "You like music," Richard repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "How delightful. Tell me, do you also enjoy things like brain surgery and rocket science? Or do you just listen to those too?" The auditorium had gone completely silent. Even the students who had been whispering were now frozen, unsure of what to do. The woman's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I play, actually. Piano." Richard let out a short laugh. Several students joined in, more out of nervousness than actual humor. "You play?" Richard said, walking toward her slowly. "The cleaning lady plays piano. How absolutely charming." "My name is Helen," she said quietly. "And yes, I do." Richard reached the edge of the stage now, looking down at her. An idea was forming in his mind, the kind of idea that came from equal parts boredom and arrogance. This could be entertaining. This could be the spark he'd been looking for. "Well then, Helen," he said, emphasizing her name like it was a joke. "I have a proposal for you. Since you enjoy music so much and since you apparently play, why don't we have a little demonstration? You and me, tomorrow evening, right here in this auditorium." The students gasped. A few whispered excitedly to each other. Helen's eyes widened slightly. I don't think... What's wrong? Richard interrupted. Too busy? Too intimidated? I understand if you'd rather stick to cleaning toilets than playing piano in front of an audience. The cruelty in his voice was obvious now. Even some of his most devoted students looked uncomfortable. But Richard was too caught up in his own brilliance to notice. This would be perfect. A little public lesson about knowing your place. About respecting those who had actually dedicated their lives to the craft. Helen stood there for a long moment, her fingers tightening around the spray bottle. Richard could see the conflict on her face. Part of her wanted to walk away. But another part, something deeper, wouldn't let her back down. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, what was that? Richard cupped his ear theatrically. I couldn't quite hear you. I said okay, Helen repeated, louder this time. Tomorrow evening, I'll be here. Richard's smile was triumphant. Excellent. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. And Helen? Try to wash your hands first. That piano is worth more than your annual salary. Helen turned and walked away without another word. The moment she disappeared, the auditorium erupted in excited chatter. Students were already pulling out their phones, texting their friends. By dinner time, everyone on campus would know about the challenge. Richard returned to the piano, feeling more alive than he had in months. Finally, something interesting. He finished the master class in high spirits, barely noticing the concerned looks from some of the older students. After class, the dean approached him, worry written all over his face. Richard, I'm not sure that was entirely appropriate. Helen is a valued member of our staff. Oh, relax. Richard waved him off. It's all in good fun. She'll play something simple. I'll play something impressive. Everyone will have a nice evening. Consider it free entertainment for the students. Still, perhaps we should... It's done, Richard said firmly. 7 o'clock tomorrow. I trust you'll make sure the auditorium is available. The dean sighed but nodded. What else could he do? Richard Sterling was, after all, Richard Sterling. That night, as Richard lay in his hotel room, he couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow would be memorable. Tomorrow he would remind everyone why he was the best. And that cleaning lady, that Helen, would learn a valuable lesson about staying in her lane. He had no idea that tomorrow evening would change his life forever. That the simple woman with the spray bottle and the rough hands would teach him something far more valuable than any masterclass ever could. That by this time tomorrow, he would understand the difference between playing notes and making music. But tonight, Richard Sterling slept soundly, dreaming of applause and vindication, completely unaware that his biggest mistake was yet to come. News traveled fast at the Riverside Music Academy. By breakfast the next morning, every student knew about the piano duel. The cafeteria buzzed with excited whispers and heated debates. I heard she used to work at a music store, one student claimed over her oatmeal. No way. My roommate said she just cleans here. Probably plays chopsticks or something, another replied. This is going to be so awkward, a third student added, shaking his head. Why would she agree to this? Sterling is going to destroy her. Helen heard some of these conversations as she wiped down tables near the student section. She kept her expression neutral, her movement steady, but inside her stomach was churning. What had she been thinking? Pride. That's what it was. Pure, foolish pride. She'd spent the entire night tossing and turning, alternating between wanting to back out and feeling a strange sense of determination. It had been so long. So very long since she'd played for anyone but herself. Don't do it. Helen turned to find Tom Chen standing beside her. Tom was the head maintenance worker, a gentleman in his 70s who had worked at the academy for nearly 40 years. He was one of the few people who ever really talked to her. I have to, Helen said quietly, scrubbing at an invisible spot on the table. No, you don't, Tom insisted. That man Sterling, he's trying to humiliate you. Everyone can see it. There's no shame in walking away. Helen stopped cleaning and looked at Tom. Maybe. But if I walk away now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what if. At least this way I'll know. Tom studied her face for a moment, then slowly nodded. You're braver than most people realize. The day crawled by. Helen went through her usual routine, cleaning classrooms, restocking supplies, emptying trash bins, but her mind was elsewhere. Her fingers unconsciously tapped rhythms against her cleaning cart. Melodies she hadn't thought about in years suddenly filled her head. Meanwhile, Richard spent his morning giving interviews to the Academy's student newspaper and music blog. He loved the attention, the way students hung on his every word. So what made you decide to challenge the janitor? One eager journalism student asked, recorder in hand. Richard leaned back in his chair, all confidence and charm. I believe in teaching moments. Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected situations. This will show my students that dedication and training matter, that you can't just casually appreciate something as complex as classical piano without putting in the years of work. But isn't it kind of mean? Another student ventured carefully. Richard's smile didn't falter. Mean? I'm giving her an opportunity to perform in a beautiful concert hall. Most people would kill for that chance. Besides, sometimes reality is uncomfortable. Better she learns this lesson now than continues living in some fantasy world. The students nodded, though a few exchanged uncertain glances when Richard wasn't looking. By 6 o'clock that evening, students began gathering outside the auditorium. The official start time was 7, but nobody wanted to miss getting a good seat. The line stretched down the hallway and around the corner. Some students brought snacks. Others had their phones ready to record. Inside, the dean paced nervously backstage. He'd tried one last time to convince Richard to call the whole thing off, but the pianist had refused. Now the dean felt trapped between his famous guest instructor and his longtime staff member. Helen arrived at 6:30, slipping in through the side entrance. She'd gone home during her lunch break to change, trading her uniform for a simple navy dress. It was nothing fancy, probably 10 years old, but it was clean and pressed. Her hands were shaking as she walked down the empty backstage corridor. In the women's dressing room, she sat in front of the mirror and tried to steady her breathing. She looked at her hands, really looked at them. They were different from the hands that used to dance across piano keys years ago, more calloused now, more worn, but they still remembered. Please, she whispered to her reflection. Please let me remember. At 7 o'clock sharp, the auditorium doors opened. Students flooded in, filling every seat. Some squeezed into the aisles. Others stood at the back. The dean had tried to limit attendance, but word had spread beyond the academy. Local music teachers showed up. A few musicians from the city orchestra heard about it and came out of curiosity. Even some faculty members who normally skipped evening events were there. The energy in the room was electric, but there was something uncomfortable about it too. Like watching a car accident about to happen. Richard entered from stage right, looking impeccable in a black suit with a crisp white shirt. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. He soaked it in, taking his time walking to center stage, waving like a conductor after a symphony. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice smooth and practiced. Tonight is about more than just music. It's about understanding the difference between appreciation and mastery, between listening and truly knowing. More applause. Richard continued, building his case like a lawyer in court. My opponent this evening is Helen, who works here at our academy. She claims to play piano. I've invited her to demonstrate, so that all of you can see what years of dedicated training produce versus casual dabbling. The way he said opponent made it sound like a joke. Some students laughed. Others shifted uncomfortably. I'll perform first, Richard announced, walking to the grand piano. To set the bar, as it were. He sat down, adjusted the bench slightly, and cracked his knuckles. Then his hands descended onto the keys. Richard had chosen one of the most technically difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It was a piece designed to showcase virtuosity, fast runs, dramatic chords, complex rhythms that could trip up even experienced pianists. And Richard played it flawlessly. His fingers flew across the keyboard with machine-like precision. Every note was perfect. Every dynamic exactly as written. The tempo never wavered. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, someone who had spent 10,000 hours perfecting their skill. The audience was mesmerized. Even people who didn't know much about classical music could tell they were watching something special. When the final chord rang out, the applause was thunderous. Students jumped to their feet. Some were actually shouting. Richard stood and bowed deeply, a satisfied smile on his face. He'd played better than usual, fueled by adrenaline and the desire to win. He walked to the side of the stage, gesturing toward the piano with exaggerated courtesy. "Helen," he called out. "Your turn." The applause died down. An expectant silence fell over the auditorium. Heads turned toward the stage entrance. For a long moment, nothing happened. Some students began to whisper. Had she backed out?
Had she finally realized how ridiculous this was?
Then Helen appeared. She walked slowly from stage left, her simple navy dress a stark contrast to Richard's expensive suit. Her face was pale but composed. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at Richard. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano, as if it was the only real thing in the room. The walk to the piano bench felt like a mile. Helen could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her legs felt weak. Her hands felt cold. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and run. But she didn't. She sat down at the bench, her back straight, her hands trembling as they hovered over the keys. The piano suddenly seemed enormous, intimidating. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her back. Richard stood off to the side, arms crossed, that smug smile still on his face. He'd already won, and he knew it. This was just the formality of proving it. Helen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. The first notes that came from Helen's fingers were soft. Almost hesitant, a few students in the back exchanged knowing glances. This was exactly what they'd expected. Richard's smile grew wider. But then something changed. Helen's hands found their confidence. The hesitation melted away like morning frost under sunlight. She was playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece that demanded not just technical skill but emotional depth, a piece that told a story. The melody began gently like a memory from childhood, sweet and innocent. Helen's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who supposedly just cleaned floors for a living. The notes weren't just accurate. They were alive. Richard's smile faded. He uncrossed his arms. Something was wrong. This wasn't supposed to be happening. The music grew more complex. Helen's left hand created a foundation of rolling chords while her right hand sang the melody above. But it wasn't mechanical. Every phrase breathed. Every note meant something. Where Richard had played Rachmaninoff like a mathematical equation solved perfectly, Helen was playing Chopin like she was pouring her heart out onto the keyboard. Students who had been smirking moments ago now sat frozen. Mouths slightly open, eyes wide, the piece moved into its more dramatic section. Helen's whole body swayed with the music now. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't performing for the audience. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply being honest with every note. The piano became an extension of herself, and the music that poured out spoke of joy and sorrow, hope and loss, struggle and perseverance. In the third row, a music theory professor leaned forward, her hand covering her mouth. She recognized something in Helen's playing, a maturity that only came from years of serious training. This wasn't a hobbyist. This was a real pianist. The technical passages came fast and furious now. Helen's fingers flew across the keyboard, but there was never any sense of showing off. Every difficult run served the emotional arc of the piece. The music built and built, climbing toward its climax with an intensity that made the air in the auditorium feel electric. Richard took an involuntary step forward. His practiced composure cracked. His face showed confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like fear. Who was this woman? Helen reached the heart of the piece, where Chopin's genius truly shone. The music was stormy now, passionate, full of conflict and resolution. Her hands moved with absolute certainty, drawing sounds from the piano that seemed impossible. Soft whispers that could barely be heard, then thunderous chords that shook the floorboards. A student in the front row had tears streaming down her face. She didn't even realize she was crying. The piece began its descent toward the conclusion. Helen's playing softened, becoming introspective. After all the drama and passion, there was a sense of acceptance, of peace. The final section was delicate, almost fragile, as if the music itself might break. Then came the ending. Not a triumphant finish, but something quieter, more profound. The last notes hung in the air like a question that didn't need an answer. Helen lifted her hands from the keys. Silence. Complete and total silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the auditorium exploded. Students leaped to their feet as if pulled by invisible strings. The applause wasn't polite or respectful. It was thunderous. People were shouting. Some were crying openly now. The standing ovation seemed to shake the very walls of the building. Helen sat at the piano, her shoulders trembling. She kept her head down, overwhelmed by the response. Her hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. Richard stood frozen at the side of the stage. His face had gone pale. The applause continued, wave after wave, and with each second it became clearer that something monumental had just happened. This wasn't just a good performance. This was something else entirely. In the back of the auditorium, an elderly woman stood with tears streaming down her face. She was Margaret Brennan, one of the Academy's founding board members and a renowned piano teacher in her younger days. Her hands clutched her purse tightly as she stared at Helen's back. "It can't be," Margaret whispered to herself. After all these years? The dean rushed onto the stage, not sure whether to congratulate Helen or try to manage the chaos. Students were pushing forward, trying to get closer. Some were holding up their phones, recording. The energy in the room had completely shifted from mockery to something close to reverence. Helen finally stood up from the piano bench. She looked dazed, as if waking from a dream. When she turned to face the audience, the applause somehow grew even louder. Richard watched all of this from the side. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly small, not because he'd lost some silly competition, but because he'd just witnessed something that made his earlier performance look like a child's recital. The difference wasn't in the notes. It was in something deeper, something he'd been missing his entire career without even knowing it. A young man near the front was shaking his head in amazement. "Did you hear that? Did you actually hear that?" He kept saying to his friend beside him. "Who is she?" another student asked. "Seriously, who is she?" Margaret Brennan was making her way down the aisle now, moving as fast as her 78 years would allow. She reached the stage and climbed the side steps with determination. Helen saw her coming and froze. Their eyes met and something passed between them. Recognition, memory, 1,000 unspoken words. "Helen Brennan," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. She used Helen's maiden name. The name she'd had before marriage. Before everything changed. The dean's head snapped around. "Brennan?" he repeated. His face went from confusion to shock to something approaching horror. "Helen Brennan?" "The Helen Brennan?" Some of the older faculty members heard the name and gasped. They began whispering urgently to each other. The name meant something to them. Something significant. Richard heard it too, but it meant nothing to him. He was too young, too focused on his own career to know the history. But he could see that something important was happening. Margaret reached Helen and took her hands. "My dear girl," she said, her voice breaking. "My brilliant, foolish, wonderful girl. Where have you been?" Helen couldn't speak. She just shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. The dean approached them, his face a mixture of emotions. "Miss Brennan, I had no idea. If I had known you were here, working here all this time, I would have what?" Helen finally found her voice. "Given me a job out of pity? Out of memory of what I used to be? You were one of the most promising students this academy ever had," Margaret said firmly. "You won the International Young Artist Competition at 19. You had scholarships to 3 different conservatories. Everyone said you'd be the next great concert pianist of your generation." The students who were close enough to hear this began whispering even more frantically. This woman, this janitor they'd barely noticed, had been a prodigy. Richard felt his stomach drop. He'd challenged a former competition winner to a piano duel. He'd mocked her in front of students. He'd treated her like she was nothing. "What happened?" the dean asked gently. "Why did you leave? You were in your final year and then you just disappeared." Helen pulled her hands away from Margaret. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very tired. "My mother got sick," she said simply. "Cancer, stage 4. I was her only family." Margaret's face crumpled with understanding and sadness. "I had to take care of her," Helen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone had to be there for the treatments, the hospital stays, the bad nights. The scholarship didn't cover family emergencies, so I withdrew, found work, did what I had to do. But that was 15 years ago. Margaret said softly. She lived for 7 years, Helen replied. 7 hard years. By the time she passed, I was 32. Too old to be a young prodigy, too out of practice to compete, too unknown to get hired by any serious institution. She looked around the auditorium, at all the students staring at her with new eyes. So I took a job here, Helen finished, because at least I could be near music, even if I couldn't make it anymore. Even if nobody knew who I was. The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, sadder. Richard wanted to disappear through the floor. Every word she spoke was a knife in his chest. He'd been so cruel, so thoughtlessly, needlessly cruel. And the worst part? He'd learned something tonight that he should have known all along. That perfection without soul was nothing. That all his technical mastery meant less than Helen's honest expression. That he'd spent his whole life playing notes instead of music. The applause had stopped. The excitement had turned to something more somber. Students who had laughed at Helen that morning now looked ashamed. Tom Chen, the old maintenance worker, had been standing in the back the whole time. He caught Helen's eye across the crowd and gave her a small nod of approval. She managed a weak smile in return. Margaret took Helen's hand again. "Stay," she said urgently. "Let me talk to the board. You belong here, Helen. Not pushing a mop, but teaching, inspiring, sharing your gift." But before Helen could respond, Richard finally found his voice. "Wait," he said, stepping forward. Everyone turned to look at him. "Please wait." All eyes turned to Richard. He stood there in his expensive suit, feeling more exposed than he'd ever felt on any stage in the world. His mouth was dry. His carefully crafted confidence had crumbled completely. "I need to say something," Richard began, his voice lacking its usual polish. "I need to apologize." Helen looked at him, her expression unreadable. The auditorium remained silent, everyone watching this unexpected turn. "What I did yesterday was wrong," Richard continued, forcing himself to meet Helen's eyes. "What I did today was worse. I treated you with contempt. I mocked you in front of students. I turned something beautiful into a spectacle meant to humiliate you." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. Apologies never had. "I thought I knew what music was," he said. "I thought it was about perfection, about hitting every note exactly right, about speed and precision and technical mastery. I've won competitions. I've played in the greatest halls in the world. Critics have called me brilliant." Richard's voice cracked slightly. "But tonight you showed me that I've been playing piano my entire life without understanding music. The difference between what you did up there and what I did, it's like comparing a photograph to the real thing. I played notes. You played truth." Several students nodded. A few whispered their agreement. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Richard said. "I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that I heard what you played, really heard it, and it changed something in me." Helen studied him for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "You're a brilliant pianist, Richard. Nobody can take that away from you. But brilliance without heart is just noise. You can play anything, but are you saying anything?" The words hit Richard harder than any criticism from any reviewer ever had. Because they were true, undeniably, painfully true. Margaret stepped forward, placing a hand on Helen's shoulder. "We have a lot to discuss, my dear. But first, I think everyone needs some time to process what happened here tonight." The dean nodded eagerly, relieved to have something practical to focus on. Yes, of course. Students, let's give everyone some space. The auditorium will close in 15 minutes. The crowd began to disperse slowly, reluctantly. Students filed out in small groups, their conversations animated and intense. This was something they'd be talking about for years. Richard didn't leave. He couldn't. He stood rooted to his spot as people moved around him. Tom Chen walked past and gave him a long, measuring look. No words, just a look that said everything. The old man had known. He'd seen Helen's worth from the beginning. Within 10 minutes, the auditorium was mostly empty. Only a few people remained. Margaret and the dean were talking quietly with Helen near the piano. Richard approached hesitantly, like a child approaching a principal's office. "Excuse me," he said softly. Helen turned to look at him. "Could I ask you something?" Helen glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "What is it?" Richard swallowed hard. "Would you teach me?" The request hung in the air. Margaret raised her eyebrows. The dean looked confused. Helen just stared at him. "Teach you what?" Helen asked. You already know how to play piano. You're better technically than I ever was. Teach me what you have, Richard said. Whatever it is that makes your music sound alive. I've spent 15 years perfecting technique, but I've never learned what you know. I'm asking, not as a favor, but as a student asking a master. Helen almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm not a master. I'm a woman who gave up her dreams and hasn't performed in public for 15 years until tonight. I work cleaning buildings, Richard. What could I possibly teach you? Everything that matters, Richard replied quietly. Margaret watched this exchange with interest. She'd known Richard's type before. Talented, arrogant, technically perfect but emotionally hollow. Most never changed. They spent their entire careers chasing applause without ever connecting with the deeper purpose of music. But sometimes, rarely, one of them woke up. She wondered if Richard was actually capable of that kind of transformation. I'm not looking for a teacher, Helen said, shaking her head. I'm just trying to survive, to get through each day. Then let me learn by watching, Richard pressed. I'll stay at the academy, cancel my other engagements. Just let me observe. Let me understand how you hear music differently than I do. The dean looked alarmed. Richard, you have commitments. The masterclass series. Your concert in Vienna next month. Cancel them, Richard said without looking away from Helen. Or postpone them. I don't care. This is more important. Helen seemed uncertain. She looked at Margaret, seeking guidance from her old teacher. He's serious, Margaret observed, studying Richard's face. I can see it. The question is whether you're ready to face music again. Helen. Not just playing in an empty room at night, but really engaging with it. I don't know if I am, Helen admitted. None of us ever know, Margaret said gently. But perhaps this young man needs what you can teach him. And perhaps you need a reason to come back to music fully. Sometimes students save teachers just as much as the other way around. Helen looked down at her hands. Those rough, calloused hands that had scrubbed floors and wiped tables and done 1,000 menial tasks. But tonight, those same hands had created something beautiful. Something that moved people. Something that reminded her of who she used to be. I'll think about it, Helen said finally. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Richard nodded, accepting this small opening. The dean cleared his throat. Helen, regardless of what you decide about Richard, Margaret and I need to discuss your position here. You shouldn't be cleaning when you could be contributing so much more to this institution. I like my job, Helen said defensively. It's honest work. It is, Margaret agreed. But it's not the only work you're capable of. Think about the students who heard you tonight. Think about what you could offer them. Helen felt overwhelmed. Too much was happening too fast. Just this morning she'd been invisible, going through her routine, keeping her head down. Now everyone was looking at her, expecting things, wanting things. I need to go, she said abruptly. I need some air. She walked quickly toward the side exit, her footsteps echoing in the nearly empty auditorium. Nobody tried to stop her. They understood that she needed space. Richard watched her go, then turned to Margaret. Tell me about her, please. Help me understand who she was. Who she is. Margaret sighed and sat down in one of the front row seats. Richard sat beside her. The dean excused himself, sensing this was a private conversation. Helen Brennan was special, Margaret began. Not just talented, but genuinely gifted. She didn't just play music. She understood it on a level most pianists never reach. When she was 17, she played Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata for her audition here. Do you know that piece? Richard nodded. It was notoriously difficult, one of the most demanding works in the piano repertoire. She didn't just play it correctly, Margaret continued. She made it sing. She made a 200-year-old piece sound like it was written yesterday. The entire audition panel was in tears by the end. We offered her a full scholarship on the spot. What happened to her mother? Richard asked. Margaret's face clouded. Breast cancer. Aggressive. Helen's father had died when she was young, so it was just the two of them. Her mother tried to make Helen stay in school, told her to keep pursuing her music, but Helen wouldn't abandon her. She moved back home, got a job to pay for treatments, and became a full-time caregiver. And when her mother died, Helen tried to come back, Margaret said quietly. She contacted me about 7 years ago, but she'd been away for so long. Her fingers weren't as nimble. She'd lost confidence. And the music world moves fast. The competitions she might have won at 21 weren't open to 28-year-olds. The opportunities had passed, so she gave up, Richard said. No, Margaret corrected. She survived. There's a difference. She took a job here because it let her be near music even if she couldn't make it. She'd practice at night sometimes when the buildings were empty. I caught her once, about 5 years ago, playing in one of the practice rooms at midnight. She was crying while she played. Richard felt something twist in his chest. While he'd been collecting awards and building his reputation, Helen had been grieving for the life she'd lost. And he'd mocked her, called her a cleaning lady, treated her gift as a joke. I need to make this right, Richard said. Margaret looked at him carefully. Making it right isn't about grand gestures. It's about genuine change. The question is whether you're capable of that. I don't know, Richard admitted, but I want to try. Margaret nodded slowly. Then start by learning humility. Real humility, not false modesty. Start by listening more than you talk. And start by understanding that music isn't about you. It's about something bigger. Richard sat in the quiet auditorium, processing everything. Outside, through the tall windows, he could see Helen standing under a streetlight. She was looking up at the sky, her arms wrapped around herself. He'd come to this academy thinking he had everything figured out. Now he realized he'd been stumbling around in the dark, calling his blindness vision. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would begin learning what music actually meant. If Helen would let him. 3 days passed before Helen gave Richard an answer. 3 days during which he canceled his upcoming concerts, much to his agent's fury. 3 days during which students whispered in hallways and videos of Helen's performance spread across social media. 3 days during which Richard sat alone in practice rooms, playing the same pieces he'd always played, but hearing them differently now. On the 4th morning, Helen found him in practice room 7. He was playing a Chopin nocturne, stopping and starting, frustrated with himself. "You're trying too hard," she said from the doorway. Richard's hands froze above the keys. He turned to see her standing there in her work uniform, a cleaning cart beside her. "I didn't hear you come in," he said. "That's because you weren't listening," Helen replied. She stepped into the room, leaving the cart outside. "You were too focused on your own playing to hear anything else." Richard stood up from the bench. "Does that mean you'll help me?" Helen crossed her arms, studying him. She'd spent 3 days thinking about Margaret's words, about whether she was ready to engage with music again, about whether this man who'd humiliated her could actually change. "I'll make you a deal," Helen said finally. "I'll work with you, but not as a teacher. I don't have the credentials for that anymore. I'll work with you as someone who listens differently, someone who can maybe help you find what you're missing." "That's all I'm asking for," Richard said. "But there are conditions," Helen continued. "First, you treat me with respect. Not because I proved something on stage, but because every person deserves that. Second, you do the same for Tom, for the cafeteria staff, for the students who aren't as talented as you. Everyone." Richard nodded. "Agreed." "And third," Helen said, her voice softer now, "you have to be honest. With yourself and with the music. No more performing for applause. No more playing to impress. If you can't commit to that, then we're wasting each other's time." "I can do that," Richard said. "I want to do that." Helen looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, then let's start now. Play that nocturne again." Richard sat back down at the piano. He positioned his hands over the keys, took a breath, and began to play. After just 8 measures, Helen stopped him. "Why did you choose this piece?" Richard blinked. "What do you mean? Why this nocturne? Why today? Why now?" "Because it's beautiful," Richard said, confused. "Because it's Chopin. Because it's in my repertoire." "Those are all wrong answers," Helen said. She sat down on the bench beside him, something that would have seemed presumptuous a week ago but now felt natural. "Play something that means something to you personally. Not something that sounds impressive, something true." Richard sat there stumped. He'd never thought about music that way. He played pieces because they were famous or difficult, or because audiences expected them. But something personal? Something true? "I don't know what that would be," he admitted quietly. "Then that's where we start," Helen said. "Before you can play music that touches other people, you need to know what touches you. What makes you sad? What makes you happy? What memory would you want to preserve forever if you could only keep one?" Richard thought about it. Really thought about it. Memories flickered through his mind. Most were of concerts, of competitions, of victories. But then one memory surfaced that was different. "My grandmother," he said slowly. "She died when I was 12. She used to sing while she cooked. Nothing fancy, just old songs. She had a terrible voice, completely off-key, but she loved singing. She's the reason I started playing piano. She told me that music was the closest thing to magic that humans could do. Helen smiled. There, that's something real. Now find that feeling. Don't play Chopin. Don't play for me. Play for your grandmother. Play what you wish you could have played for her while she was alive. Richard put his hands on the keys again. This time he didn't think about technique or precision. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen. The smell of bread baking, her off-key singing, the way she'd hug him and tell him he was going to do great things. The music that came out was simpler than what he usually played. Just a melody he improvised, nothing complex or showy. But it was honest. It was real, and when he finished, his eyes were wet. That, Helen said softly, is what music is supposed to be. The weeks that followed changed Richard in ways he couldn't have imagined. Helen didn't teach him new techniques. She taught him to listen, to feel, to understand that every note was a choice and every choice should mean something. They worked together in the early mornings before Helen's shift started and late evenings after she finished. Sometimes they barely played at all. They'd sit and listen to recordings, and Helen would point out moments where a pianist made a choice to serve the music rather than show off. Hear that? She'd say. That pause. That tiny hesitation. That's vulnerability. That's the pianist admitting they don't have all the answers. That moment of uncertainty makes everything that follows more powerful. Richard began to understand that his pursuit of perfection had actually been a form of hiding. If every note was perfect, he never had to risk being truly seen. But music without vulnerability was just sound. Meanwhile, Helen was changing too. Margaret had convinced the board to offer her a position as a part-time instructor. Helen had hesitated, unsure if she could handle standing in front of students again. But with Margaret's encouragement and Richard's example of someone genuinely trying to learn, she'd accepted. Her first class was small, just 8 students. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she introduced herself. But the moment she sat at the piano to demonstrate something, all that nervousness disappeared. This was where she belonged. 2 months after the infamous duel, the Academy announced a special recital. Both Helen and Richard would perform. No competition this time. No judgment. Just music. The auditorium filled up quickly. Many of the same students who'd witnessed the duel came back. But the atmosphere was completely different now. There was excitement, yes, but also respect. Anticipation without cruelty. Helen performed first. She'd chosen pieces she loved. Pieces that meant something to her personal journey. Debussy's Clair de Lune, because it reminded her of playing for her mother during difficult nights. Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata, because it captured both sorrow and hope. When she finished, the applause was warm and genuine. Then came Richard's turn. He sat at the piano, and for a moment, he just breathed. Then he began to play. He'd chosen to play the same Rachmaninoff prelude from the duel, the piece he'd used to try to humiliate Helen. But everything was different now. The notes were the same, but the music was transformed. Where before it had been technically perfect but emotionally empty, now it breathed with life. Richard played with vulnerability, with honesty, with soul. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was sharing something real. In the audience, students who had heard both performances sat in stunned silence. The contrast was staggering. Same pianist, same piece, completely different music. When Richard finished, the applause was immediate and powerful. But more importantly, when he stood and bowed, Helen stood too, applauding from offstage. Their eyes met, and Richard saw something there he'd never expected to earn. Respect, friendship, understanding. After the recital, students crowded around both of them. Questions flew fast and enthusiastic. What had changed? How had Richard transformed so completely? What was Helen's secret? There's no secret, Helen told them. Music isn't about being the best or the most technically perfect. It's about being honest. It's about saying something true through sound. Anyone can learn techniques, but only you can share your own truth. Richard added, and sometimes you need someone to show you that you've been hiding behind your talent instead of using it to connect. I thought I was a great pianist. Helen showed me I was just a talented one. There's a difference, a young student raised her hand. But how do we learn to play like that? With feeling? You live, Helen said simply. You experience joy and pain. You love people. You lose people. You struggle and you grow, and then you bring all of that to the piano. Music isn't separate from life. It's a reflection of it. As the evening wound down and the auditorium emptied, Richard and Helen stood together near the piano. "Thank you," Richard said, "for giving me a second chance, for teaching me what I should have learned years ago." "Thank you for being willing to learn," Helen replied. "That's rarer than you think. Most people, when confronted with their own limitations, just make excuses. You chose to change. What happens now?" Richard asked. Helen smiled. "Now we keep learning, both of us, because music is infinite and we'll never fully understand it, but that's what makes it beautiful." Richard looked at the piano, then back at Helen. "You know what's funny? I came here thinking I was going to teach students about excellence. Instead, a woman I tried to humiliate taught me about humanity. Life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn," Helen said, "even when we're too arrogant to realize we need teaching." They walked out of the auditorium together. No longer pianist and janitor, no longer master and student, but two people who'd found their way back to what music really meant. Outside, the evening air was cool and clean. Students passed by, some calling out goodnight to both of them. Tom Chen was locking up one of the side buildings. He saw them and gave a knowing nod. "You were right," Richard called out to him. "That first day, you knew," Tom smiled. "I knew she was something special. But you figured it out on your own. That's what matters." As they parted ways, Richard heading to his temporary apartment and Helen to her small house across town, both of them felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Not satisfaction or pride, but something quieter, something deeper. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally understanding what you're supposed to be doing with your gift. Not using it to elevate yourself above others, but using it to connect, to share truth, to remind people that beauty exists in the world, even in difficult times. Music wasn't about winning. It never had been. It was about being brave enough to be honest, skilled enough to express that honesty clearly, and humble enough to know that perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was the goal. Understanding was the goal. Truth was the goal. And finally, both Richard and Helen had found their way there.